Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for this very special Earth Week event. I'm Jennifer Cullivan from the Alumni Office, and today we have the pleasure of welcoming very special guest, Distinguished Teaching Professor Dr. Don Leopold. Dr. Leopold is at Clark Reservation State Park in Janesville today, and he's going to be speaking about native plant species in the area. Dr. Leopold, thank you for being here today, and take it away.
Thanks, Jennifer. So we're going to look at some of the spring wildflowers, mostly herbaceous species, but a couple of woody plants as well. And they're some of the earliest blooming plants in New York State. Probably one of the most well-known that almost everybody can identify wildflowers is the Dutchman breeches, Dicentra cucularia. And it has just such a really interesting flower that looks kind of like a pair of pants hanging up on a clothesline. So it looks very similar, the foliage looks very similar to squirrel corn, but if you dig them up, and you shouldn't dig them up, but if you happen to be gardening with them, you'll see a little tuber is very white on Dutchman breeches, and it looks like a popcorn for squirrel corn, and the flower looks more heart-shaped for the squirrel corn. But they're both very common woodland species in rich, moist soils. Now we're out at Clark Reservation, which has, it's famous for its fern diversity, over 25 fern species, lots of wildflowers, and in part because the soils here are very rich, they're very high in calcium, and they're just incredibly fertile, and so you have a great wildflower diversity where the deer haven't eliminated the plants. So we're going to just walk around. We're not going to go on a really nice hike, unfortunately. This might be a challenge as it is with technology. We'll see how this goes. But we're going to take a short walk around the native plant garden. When I first came to Clark about 35 years ago, the plantings were all non-native plants, and it sent a really not a particularly good message, I think, about how beautiful our native plants are. And so over the years, a bunch of volunteers have converted it to a really nice collection of wildflowers. So let's look at another early blooming plant. Unfortunately, not blooming yet, but it's a very distinctive plant, especially the foliage. And it's a lot of these plants occur together in the woodlands in central New York and really the eastern United States. And so if you see one, you typically see almost all the others, but you might have to walk a mile to see all of them. This is called the early meadow rue, and it has fern-like foliage. It kind of looks a little bit like the columbine foliage, which it's related to, but the flowers look nothing like the columbine. These flowers are yellow and not particularly showy individually, but in mass, they're quite distinct. The early meadow rue, Thalictricum dioicum. So we're going to walk over to the main part of the garden and check out what's blooming. There are about 20 species blooming in the garden right now. And if you come out other times of year, something else will be blooming. But it's a very nice collection and a good place to see probably 50, 60 species total over the course of the year. So there are a bunch of plants in the garden that they're just starting to leaf out. They're going to be more summer blooming, but some really interesting native plants. And then some that, like the swamp milkweed and the common milkweed, are some of the last species to emerge out of the ground each spring. We're going to go over to one of the most common flowering small trees, subcanopy trees, each spring. And it goes by so many common names that it's easier just to remember the scientific name, Amelanchier arborea, the serviceberry. It's also called shadblow, shadbush, because it blooms when the shad run in the mid-Atlantic rivers, in the northeastern rivers. It's called serviceberry because often people in the Appalachians would be, those who passed over the winter, there would be services for them in the spring when this tree was blooming. It's beautiful in flower. It's especially nice in fruit. The fruit is delicious, and I think it's as good as a blueberry. And the fall color is outstanding. So it's a shade tolerant, very nice subcanopy tree if anybody's looking for a nice native tree, and very widely available. Lots of horticultural varieties. The serviceberry. So we're going to move along here, and there are a lot of violets that are just starting to emerge, and they're quite challenging often to identify in the woods. Some are easy, some are not so easy. Let's look at another really common wildflower that is an early bloomer. In fact, it blooms so early that it's done blooming. There's some petals left here, and the foliage is so distinct. The foliage for bloodroot, Sanguinaria canadensis. And the flowers are beautiful. They're short-lived, but the foliage will be maintained throughout the growing season, and it's very attractive. And one of the neat aspects of bloodroot is the rootstock. So it spreads by these rhizomes, and if you cut into the rhizome, it has the appearance of blood. It looks like a severed finger, and it's really a cool plant. But it spreads very nicely in a garden, and the seeds are spread by ants. The seeds have it's almost like a booger on it that is rich in protein. And the ants take those seeds to their nest, and where there's lots of ant excrement, it's a really rich environment, and the plants will germinate, seeds will germinate and form really nice patches. So it'll move around quite a bit in the landscape. The bloodroot, Sanguinaria canadensis. There's another wildflower that isn't quite blooming, but you can't mistake it for anything else, and that's the mayapple. And mayapple, it usually is a single leaf or a double leaf. And if it has a double leaf, it'll have a flower in between. So the single leaves are flowerless. And this is another one that if you look, you can see on the ground, you see these sort of linear patterns. It spreads readily by underground shoots or rhizomes. But it's a beautiful, large, almost a gardenia-like flower, about 1.5 inches in diameter, waxy in appearance, a really attractive native wildflower. It does well in sun and shade and everything in between. Another common wildflower associated with all the plants we're going to see is called the bellwort. This is the large flowered bellwort. And if you remember, if you had any coursework in plants at ESF, historically, a lot of these plants were in the lily family. But the lily family has recently been broken up into 6 new families that new to New York State. And so now this is in a different family than the lily family. But it is related to lilies, really beautiful golden petals in a pendulous form. A large flowered bellwort, Uvularia grandiflora, because it's a large flower. Other uvularias are smaller. Along the way here, there are some ferns, and I want to point out a few of them. This is the Christmas fern, and the Christmas fern is an evergreen fern. And if you look at the individual pinnae, it has sort of a booty, like a Christmas stocking appearance. That's why it's called a Christmas fern, plus the fact that it's evergreen. But all ferns in New York State, except for 3, are protected by state law. So especially at a state park or any place that's private property, you should never pick or dig up any ferns. A plant that is just past flowering, you can see a few remnant flowers, and the flowers can be white, they can be purple, or they can be pink, with this really distinctive 3-lobed leaf is the hepatica. And here's another one that taxonomically, for decades, we've known it as the genus Hepatica. And more recently, some taxonomists have put it into anemone. But regardless, this is the one with the sharp leaf shape, not rounded. And it's called a Hepatica acuta loba. And it comes in white, pink, or purple. Beautiful colors. One of the first of all the plants to bloom. All right, we're going to make our way around, and we're going to see another woody plant in full bloom. Very common shrub in central New York, especially rich woodlands. And I just broke it off, and I can smell a really great aroma of spicebush, Lindera benzoin, with the yellow flowers. Those yellow flowers will give way to some really beautiful bluish green leaves and red fruit later in the season. And it's the sole larval food for the spicebush swallowtail. So a lot of these native plants, a lot of native animals really depend on them. Tucked behind the water fountain here, nice aesthetic feature, is the toothwort. And this is another one that I learned it as the genus Dentaria, but it's now Cardamine, and it's the lace or the cutleaf toothwort. So it's in the mustard family. So the mustard family has 4 petals, and it used to be called the crucifer family, meaning cross-like, for the 4 petals. So the cutleaf toothwort. So walking along here, there's a plant that's emerging with one of the most distinctive new foliage. It's purple, really. There's nothing that comes out like it. And you see a cluster of flowers at the top that aren't open yet. When those open, the flowers will be also purple with these yellow centers. It's the blue cohosh, Caulophyllum phyllotroides. And what we don't see in this whole patch here, for a number of reasons, is the native leek. Wild leek is almost always not far away from the blue cohosh. And wild leeks are of great interest to people who like to harvest wild plants, to restaurants. They're sold for a fairly high price. The problem is that they're over harvested. And like a lot of these wildflowers, they take 6 to 10 years to go from seed to flower. And so when you start ripping up whole patches, you're ripping up decades and decades of growth. And so harvesting the wild leek, which unfortunately isn't here, but it is elsewhere at Clark, you have to, you can really only take a little bit. Ideally, you don't take the bulb underground, which a lot of people enjoy, and you just maybe take 10% of the foliage each year, and you should be able to sustain that population and harvest it as well. So another wildflower that people often notice more for the foliage and not the flowers is the wild ginger. And so I've shown this to so many people over the years, and they'll recognize the heart-shaped leaf. They can't describe the flower because the flower is underneath the leaf. And right now, I hope they'll forgive me for picking this, but right now you'll see the beginning of that flower. It's a purple flower with really distinct prongs. It's not fully open yet. And by the way, I should mention, I think I'm allowed to mention that the Wildflowers of the Adirondacks book that we published last year has nice close-ups of all these flowers. And although the title says Adirondacks, it's really meant for most of the northeastern United States. So this will be, in fact, if you look in here even further, you'll see all of these little plants those are the cotyledons. So these are the seedlings. This is another plant that's dispersed by ants, but a lot of the seeds don't get dispersed, so they just germinate in place. This will form a really dense mass, and the roots are right above the ground, and they smell like ginger. This is not related to ginger. It is not even supposed to be eaten, although it's in a lot of foraging type books. It is toxic. There's a carcinogen in that rootstock, and you should not be eating it, regardless of what Yoel Gibbons and others might tell you. Wild ginger, Asarum canadense. So there's a lot of patches of wild ginger, and there's a patch of the golden Alexanders that is right here, and this will be really brilliant. It's in the parsley family. It kind of looks like some bad plants, like the goutweed that a lot of us try to get rid of in our garden. But this is a native plant, typically in gardens, and a lot of swallowtails really enjoy the foliage on any member of the parsley family, the Apiaceae. It'll be really beautiful in a couple of weeks. Another fern that is not evergreen, but also has this distinct appearance in the winter, is the ostrich fern. It looks a little bit like a sensitive fern, but that's a different fern altogether. This is a fern that you find along creeks and these ditches. It really is a wetland fern. Now, this is the fern that is most edible. This is the one that you go to Wegmans and pay $45 a pound for fiddleheads. They'll be emerging in the next few weeks. And you'll also see these remnant here the fiddlehead is just starting to form right here. Ostrich fern. We have a big patch of spice bush and a big patch of flowering raspberry. Flowering raspberry, really beautiful in midsummer, and a big patch of the red osier, the red steady dogwood. And a lot of plants still not visible, except for last year's the flower heads on the wild bergamot and Canada goldenrod. So we often don't think of grass-like plants as wildflowers, but they're all blooming right now. This is one of the woodland sedges. Sedges are typically in wetlands, sunny wetlands, but there are a few with broader leaves that are really very showy in our woodlands. So this is one of the many woodland sedges blooming right now. And a plant that we wouldn't normally see in a wildflower garden unless they had some type of standing water is the marsh marigold. And this is central New York, some of our wetlands, acres and acres of marsh marigold, Caltha palustris, a really beautiful member of the buttercup family. Looks a lot like a buttercup. Big leaves when they fully expand, but very common in our cedar swamps and our fens and other places that have a little hint of calcareous water. And behind it, it's going to be hard to see, but there's the fiddlehead starting to emerge from the maidenhair ferns. So ferns in general have fiddleheads, but only a few are really edible. And again, they're all protected by state law except for 4 or 3. So you shouldn't be out harvesting those unless you're on land where you have permission of the landowner for that harvesting. And there are so many other plants that aren't blooming yet that we'll be seeing soon. I'm going to try to carefully get in here and show you what is the most famous of all the spring wildflowers. And there's a purple one to my left, but right here is the white trillium, Trillium grandiflorum. So we have white trillium, painted trillium, nodding trillium, and the purple trillium are the 4 trilliums fairly common in New York State. But the first ones to bloom are the white and the purple. The white will turn pink, and so often somebody will send me a picture of a pink trillium, thinking it's a species that isn't described, and it's just the nature of white trillium going to pink. Painted trillium blooms about 2 weeks later, and it has this brilliant reddish band on the inside. And then nodding trillium, unless you're in a swamp, you won't see it. It's the latest blooming, and it's just really a beautiful trillium. Also in here, and not quite at the point where they're going to really be spectacular looking, but they form really nice carpets. And the leaf looks a little bit like a maple. This is the foam flower, Tiarella cordifolia. Cordifolia means heart-shaped leaves, referring to the leaf here. And they'll have these nice, almost like a bottle brush, bright white cluster of white flowers. And it's a great native plant for the shade garden because it spreads very nicely by stolons above ground shoots. So those are just a few of the many species that are starting to emerge. And some years they're earlier, some years later. This year, if we were doing this tomorrow, they might have snow on them. But they're well adapted to those weather conditions. And I do see one more thing that I meant to point out. So I'm going to see if we can get the camera over to the left here and show you the trout lily. The trout lily has this mottled foliage, and that mottled foliage, some people think it kind of looks like a trout, the side of a trout, and that's why it's called trout lily. Others say it's called trout lily because they bloom. I had a colleague, Harry Payne, that would tell me when he saw this blooming, that's when he would get his fly rod out. He wouldn't bother fishing until that time. Any time before that, he said it was too early, but the water temperatures were just right when this plant blooms. It's another member of the lily family, and it's got 2 sets of 3 petals that fold back. So this is just starting to open up. And I think I was out here last year, the first week in April, and these were at their peak bloom. So we're a little bit behind, I think, this year. So the trout lily, Erythronium americanum. And these are really important plants that they come out very early in the year. They're very active. They're taking up lots of nutrients. Uh, they act as it's called a vernal dam. They actually keep nutrients from washing out into the streams, and they have a very important role, even though they look so small. They will go through their entire life cycle above ground by the end of May. So they've got about 2 months to do everything, and then they disappear. They're called spring vernals, and then they're gone. So we do a lot of biological surveys on properties around the Northeast, and if we do those in June or July, there's a bunch of wildflowers that we don't ever see. We don't know they're even there, like the squirrel corn and the Dutchman britches and the trout lily here. A lot of other wildflowers like the sanguinaria, the bloodroot, are above ground year round, so you can tell where they are. There's another plant emerging here that looks kind of like it's a dragon coming out of the earth, and it's a real robust plant. It'll get about 5 feet high, and with a flower stalk that's another 3 or 4 feet high. It's called the black snake root, and it's another plant like all these others, found on really rich soils with lots of fertility and typically not a lot of light. This is another great garden plant. It used to be Semisophuca racemosa, and I think it's recently been put into the genus Actia, but it's readily available at garden places that are serious about plants, and it's a great woodland species. It doesn't require any sunlight at all. So that's just a little overview to some of the many species of wildflowers that are visible in early to mid-April, and we'll try to do this again. We'll see if we can get if there's any bugs in the technology worked out. So always fun to do things, more fun in person. So I hope you'll join us in the fall for our next alumni walk and maybe an in-person bourbon tasting. So thank you for having me.